Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop. I'm a City Club member and the CEO here. When it comes to firearms, we're all familiar with the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. As a nation and as a community, that's our starting point 225 years ago. Those words were penned by our nation's founders, and we might debate whether they would agree or disagree with stand-your-ground laws or castle doctrines. They surely would be disappointed with the number of citizens being shot and killed over disputes spawned by loud music and a perception of threat, as was the subject of a now famous criminal case decided in Florida this month. However, some of these founding fathers, a former vice president and a former Treasury Secretary, perhaps even more famously, settled a dispute over honor with dueling firearms on the banks of the Hudson River. To be sure, then, our founding fathers understood that guns would be employed not just in revolution, but also in self-defense and dispute resolution. Still, there can be no doubt that guns of all sorts are implicated in a large amount of violence in our country and in our communities. In the 6 months following the Newtown shootings, the New York Daily News reported that nationwide 40 children under the age of 12 were accidentally killed by guns, either having shot themselves or having been shot by a sibling. We have little need here in Northeast Ohio to revisit school shootings. At Case Western Reserve University, Chardon High School, or Success Tech, not a half mile from where we sit today. Guns are also a part of the criminal violence in our communities. The Harvard School of Public Health reported that in 2010, there were more than 11,000 people killed by others with guns, many of which involved criminal activity. And that's not all the gun deaths either in 2010. That same year, more than 19,000 people committed suicide with a firearm. On the other hand, guns are used in self-defense numerous times every year. The National Rifle Association puts the annual number at 2.5 million. The Violence Policy Center puts it at a little less than 68,000 times a year when guns are used in self-defense. Somewhere between a third and a half of all U.S. households have a gun, and of those that own firearms, over 65% say they own them for self-defense. Moreover, of the estimated 300 million firearms owned by private citizens, only a tiny fraction are ever used in a crime. Indeed, most are used for lawful sporting purposes or for self-protection. If the Second Amendment is where we begin, then this is where we are. We are also at a point in time in which the question of how we grapple with these realities has become one of the most contentious and fractious policy issues we face. Those who care deeply about this set of issues seem not to speak the same language. So today, we're here to conduct a great experiment to see if we can find common ground on this divisive issue. And in all seriousness, we might fail. But if anyone can succeed here, it's our moderator. Dennis Terez is the federal defender for the state of Ohio and president-elect of the federal bar for the Northern District of Ohio. He's a former partner at Squire Sanders, a City Club member, and a proud advocate of the Sixth Amendment. And Dennis, it's our great pleasure to have you as our moderator today. I'll let you introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here, everyone. Dan's challenge to us to find common ground is indeed that. I know a number of people in the audience here, and they know that at times lawyers have tried to reach that common ground and have failed. In addition to the one line that makes up the Second Amendment that Dan so accurately read, a one line that goes back to 1791 in our country's history and that hasn't been changed, I would be remiss, particularly as a lawyer, not to mention that in 2008 and 2010, the Supreme Court, in what one might expect a very divided opinion, had also something to say about the Second Amendment. In a case called District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court, in an opinion written by Justice Scalia, held in a 5-4 decision that the Second Amendment must be applied to individuals on a federal jurisdictional basis. That's why it was in the District of Columbia. The district tried to ban handguns in a very broad fashion. The Supreme Court struck that down. In 2010, 2 years later, with one new member of the Supreme Court, this time Justice Souter being replaced by Justice Sotomayor, both, by the way, who were in the dissent of that 5-4 opinion, another 5-4 opinion, this time written by Justice Alito in a case called McDonald versus the City of Chicago, similarly held that the Second Amendment has relevance to everyone on a state basis, so that both the federal level and the state level of our jurisdictions took the Second Amendment, what Dan just read, very seriously. With those recent cases in mind, both which were designed clearly as challenges to broad handgun laws, I get to introduce our speaker with a question. But before I pose the question, let me introduce our speakers today. The gentleman first on the furthest part of the podium here is Dr. Edward Hill. Ned Hill comes from our own Cleveland State University, where he is Dean of the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs. He has a PhD from MIT, a master's also from MIT, and also has a BA from the University of Pennsylvania in Economics and Urban Studies. Ned is on this podium in part because of an article and a study that he did that was also reported on in our Cleveland Plain Dealer last April. In it, he controversially, for some, and less so for others, observed that between 2001 and 2010, one short nine-year period, almost 1 million persons in the United States were either killed or wounded by gunfire. The debate obviously continues greatly in our Cleveland Plain Dealer due to the person seated to my immediate left. A columnist for the Plain Dealer, Phillip Morris, has written extensively on this issue, both from a personal and a more public side. He is an admitted gun-carrying person who has carried concealed weapon and has supported his position in columns that he's written, with titles as controversial, or again, perhaps not for some, as Guns on Teachers is not the best solution to securing our schools, Trying to Stop the Gun-Happy Kids, and other similar observations of where our limits might be. He has a BA from the Ohio Wesleyan University, was also a finalist for Columnist for a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2010 and 2011, and was also recognized as a Distinguished Writing Award for commentary and column writing from the American Society of News Editors just last year. I welcome both of them to this discussion, not a debate, not a challenge, but rather our attempt to have a civil conversation on this very difficult issue. I start out with the question to both of them. Gentlemen, did the Supreme Court get it right by banning handguns? By not allowing us to ban handguns by those state laws and federal laws?
Well, Dennis, I actually think that the Supreme Court's decision for this conversation is irrelevant. There's never been so much discussion, so much polarization, so much argument about how to diagram a sentence, since I got out of Mr. Martiska's English class my freshman year in high school. The argument about a comma is lunacy. I think what we have to do is instead face the reality of the use of firearms in American society. We have to respect the cultures and the cultural differences that end up with very different approaches about how guns should be regulated or used. And I think we have to start a conversation with a common ground, or try to find a common ground. The Second Amendment, the conversation about the Second Amendment is polarizing. It prevents conversation, and we should realize the Constitution also allowed slavery. It was amended to prohibit alcohol. It's a document which is very difficult to change, which is the way it should be, but it's a document that can be amended. But you can't amend or change that document unless there's a broad consensus of the role of firearms in American society. So I respectfully acknowledge the decisions of the Supreme Court and say, okay, now let's get on with the real serious conversation.
Phillip?
And I would echo and agree with most of what Dr. Hill just said. As to the question of gun ownership, gun rights, self-defense, obviously this has been the most intractable conversation this nation has ever had to endure. As you mentioned, the question of slavery was solved within 100 years of the nation's founding. Primary issues like women's suffrage, even hot-button topics like abortion, capital punishment, they all pale in comparison to the amount of rhetoric, heated rhetoric, and hostilities on both sides of this issue, because it's always framed as a debate, not as a discussion. which is part of the reason why I was drawn to this invitation today, to have people that wanted to sit down, regardless of where we stood on the issue, and said, what are the common grounds? Where can we begin to find those touch points that unite us rather than divide us?
Let me move into a topic area. Before I do, let me just readdress something that's of interesting historical note, given the fact that both speakers have tried to emphasize that we're here on a very divisive topic, trying to find a common ground. In McDonald versus Chicago, the 2010 Supreme Court opinion, they reversed the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. So it was a reversal of another Court of Appeals view on this very issue. In Heller versus District of Columbia, they affirmed the District of Columbia's Court of Appeals. So we even had a split on the two levels of Court of Appeals for that matter. And a friend of the court brief, something that's often done on important issues, in McDonald versus the City of Chicago, the Supreme Court received an amicus brief that was of historic importance. 58 senators and 251 members of the House of Representatives signed off on an amicus curiae brief, the largest number of representatives or senators ever in the Supreme Court's history on one single amicus. So to try to mend some of the divisive points, let me address and have you both address this very important issue that you touch upon, Phillip, in your columns and Ned in your studies. Are we dealing with a public safety issue or a public health issue, or are they one and the same?
I think we're dealing with both. And in addition to that, I think we're dealing with a question of a nation and of a culture that's becoming increasingly nervous. Crime appears to be down in recent years, but the number of people that are carrying firearms are up. In the opening statement, I believe Dan referred to an incident over the weekend where two men in a Walmart got into an altercation. One man began to lose a fist fight, so he pulled out a gun, killed his opponent, and called it self-defense. And 2 days after the shooting, he was still had not been arrested because police were seriously considering his contention that I feared for my life. So the question is, moving forward, how do we address the issue that, A, we are a very nervous culture, and we address this by saying, do guns lead to an increased nervousness? Or is it the fact that we have been led to believe that we're in a position where if we're not armed, we render ourselves too vulnerable?
And how do you answer that question?
Well, I'll jump in for a second and saying that this is both public health and public safety, and they're different questions. The public health issue is one where the ratio of wounds to murders, wounds and assault to murders, has gone from 3.6 to 4.9. So that means people are dying less frequently, the homicide rate's down, the death rate is down from assault, the death rate overall for firearm injury has been dead flat, pardon the use of the term dead, and that's because suicide rates have been going up, and we have to look at suicide as a public health issue that is aided, abetted, and motivated by access to firearms. The fact that we've gone from 3.6 to 4.9 ratio of wounded to murder is not a testament to the fact that people have gotten worse as shots. Maybe they have, but is a testament to the improvement of the emergency medical system and what we've learned from Iraq and Afghanistan to keep people alive of very serious gunshots. Here's the terrible, wicked dilemma from a public health and public finance standpoint. As people survive, they tend to be uninsured, they tend to be young men, and they tend to have very significant wounds that keep them the rest of their life, which means that it's now a public finance issue. Susan Ackerman sitting here with she's one of my friends and colleagues from the Center of Community Solutions, that she's looking at the public finance impacts of this. And you could find nursing homes across the state that are filled with people in wheelchairs who have lifetime disabilities because they've survived a gunshot wound. So we do have to take this and say that change the frame of the debate, which I hear from people who take an extreme position, that society has to bear any cost in any circumstance to allow people to bear arms. And start really change that conversation to be one, where's the level of cost, who bears that cost, and also what are we willing to suffer in terms of dead and wounded people. At the same time, so that's one extreme point, at the same time recognize that there are hunters, or friends of mine that use and live off the deer they shoot. Not in Lakewood, by the way. We wish they would. But there are serious issues of public safety. And if you look at the incidents of gun violence around the United States, that you will see an incidence that clearly maps with the old Confederacy in the far West. But do we want, as some people have said, that an armed society is a polite society, and other people will say a fully armed society is a wild, wild west. That's the reason why we have to go from this polar discussion to say, what are the expectations? What are the public health implications? How do we pay, and who is the incidence of paying for this privilege? And we also have to figure out how to protect people and keep them alive.
Phillip, is it so that we're in a society where crime is down because we are better armed?
Many people would take that point of view.
Crime's down because we're older.
Or perhaps more of us are incarcerated or
That's
in the
also
cemetery.
true.
The bottom line is, in terms of reframing this argument, to have it to consider more the public health piece, which Dr. Hill is absolutely correct on, I think it involves getting to the point where we realize that the equivalent of a Sandy Hook happens in this country every week. I mean, if we're just doing the accumulative body count. So how do we reframe the argument so people aren't necessarily moved by the mass casualties, but realizing that each hour in America, several people are going down as a result of gunshots. I think part of moving the needle on this issue involves little things. For instance, the other day I was driving through Cleveland Heights, and I saw a sign in front of the First Presbyterian Church at the intersection of Monticello and Lee. And it said, these are the number of casualties in Cuyahoga County since Sandy Hook.
And 175.
As of Wednesday night, they were up to 175 casualties. To me, that was a useful community reminder coming from a church that this is something that we're forced to deal with on a daily basis. And while we're constantly reminded of the mass casualties of a Sandy Hook or of a Chardon, that no, this problem, a public health problem, is something that we should be grappling with and thinking about daily because it's in our community.
Polls show that since those mass shootings, and we'll touch upon mass shootings as a separate concept or topic to discussion a little bit later in our discussion here, polls show that the public support of private ownership of guns and public's opposition to gun control both have increased since mass shootings. Did that come as a surprise to either of you? Particularly in light of what the church says on its sign.
I think that, again, there's been a drumbeat of the dramatically deadly versus the systematically harmful. And that dramatically deadly may have taken people feel, as Phillip would call them, nervous, insecure. And if society doesn't provide me safety in a public space, maybe I have to take it on to myself, even though the data shows that the more people that are armed, the more dangerous it actually is to be out there, and the incidence of harm from gunshot goes up when you have a gun in your house. That's a decision individuals have to make. I'm going to make a decision for me that's different from decisions other people will take. But we do have to figure out ways in which to make certain that a broad cultural acceptance of private weapons and carrying weapons and licensed weapons is respected. We should try to make a society so people's feel for need to carry a weapon is reduced. And we need to make certain that the liability that surrounds the ownership of that weapon is borne by the person who carries the weapon. To say that the rest of society should pay for the privilege of some people to make a decision to carry a lethal weapon is absurd.
Interesting that he uses the word privilege, though. Privilege or a right. In terms of
It's that comma.
That comma, that darn comma. the whole notion, though, of polling and the way that it may accurately or inaccurately reflect the American public, I get real nervous with polls because sometimes when you read the language of these polls, especially after one of these mass shootings, the wording will go to, it affects a reaction that might suggest that if the gun wasn't there, that perhaps the shooting wouldn't have happened. But I would like to see a poll that at some point questions the way Americans feel about the reality that there are often defensive shootings that happen where someone is able to protect life and property, or how many times does the weapon create a situation where a serious crime may have occurred were it not for an armed civilian?
I got to admit that I've tried to find arms length data on this, and I can't find it. And the fact of the number of people who were killed with a firearm from 2001 to 2010, less than 4,000 of them were legal shootings, which would mean shootings allowed by law. And the
As long as they're reported.
that are reported that, well, the CDC does a good job. These data come out of emergency rooms. So, so the fact is that there are legal shootings, there are legal wounds. But there's still over 470,000 people over that time period. Hold it, let me get the number. I hate making up numbers. Murder during that time period, 119,000 people were murdered with a firearm. 3,000 people were killed legally during that time period. So I don't see that much defense. I think it's out there, but the number of people who were wounded in assault were 471,000 people wounded in assault.
But that's just the body count. What I'm speaking of is that American who defended his or her right,
I understand.
using universal defense, you know, that right, you know, to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And, you know, of course, that's hard to quantify. But I still think, to the question of polling, we might get a more accurate sense of how Americans really felt on guns if the question base was expanded.
Do you think that the difficulty that Congress now has in passing gun control legislation is also a reflection, not necessarily the members of Congress and our Senate, but rather the public as a whole?
Sure.
Is it a fair reflection of that sentiment nationwide?
Well, we are now outside, well, the gun control issue is part of it, the abortion issue is a part of it. There are a number of hot button single issues that people feel very passionately about, and that becomes their one vote. And that becomes where they donate money. In the same way, environmentalists feel the same, have it going. So what you find in politics is that the more heavily invested a group is around that one issue, they can actually organize better than someone who has a broad array of issues, and this is one of them. And I think we aren't going to get anywhere if we don't look at that expression on the part of highly committed gun owners with respect, realizing that target shooting and hunting is all part of American culture, that public safety is a legitimate issue. And so that's where I want to start the conversation. I don't want to start with the conversation and say that it is inappropriate for someone to want to have a concealed weapon.
Although the truth of the matter, as we all know in this room, because the president himself has been so vocal on this issue, he can't even get regulations of assault weapons.
That's correct.
So does that reflect the attitude of the public?
I think the issue around assault weapons by themselves, look, there are extremists, there are government conspiracy theorists, and there's a gun industry, all highly invested in this issue. And when you have the Republican Party so badly split, so that the center of the Republican Party doesn't have ground or traction, and when you've had gerrymandering to the extent that we've had in the United States, and by the way, if the Dems had the same thing, they'd do it as well, that what you've done is you've taken the middle of American politics and separated it to the extreme left and extreme right. So I mean, it's difficult to say, but it's true that in the state of Ohio, one of the problems we have with the gun debate in the state is we've given the legislature a lobotomy by term limits, and we have gerrymandered to the point so the extremes control the debate. So part of the common ground is also trying to figure out ways to empower the middle of the political debate and honor it, rather than take our political parties and make them pander to both of their extremes. And they pander. They don't pander well, but they pander.
Phillip, you took advantage of a law that's now on the books in Ohio, and it has been amended virtually every year to some degree, and that's our carry concealed weapon law here in Ohio. You mentioned earlier in this discussion that it was a privilege to own a gun. You took advantage of that privilege. Could you tell us why?
Actually, that's slightly incorrect. I do own a gun, but taking advantage of that privilege to carry it in public is not something that I've taken advantage of at this point. But the whole question of CCW, I think was a question that the state had a valid and a serious argument going forward, while the NRA does hold powerful sway in Columbus. I thought that the debate over carry concealed, which went on for years, was actually a good debate. And at the end of the day, of course, I agreed with it. I find that the people that I know who carry in public, for the most part, aren't people that I would worry about. The folks that I would worry about are folks who would never take the opportunity to get a CCW, or for whatever reasons might be forbidden to get a CCW, which is in itself another issue.
We have only 5 minutes before we open this up to discussion by the audience. I'm going to end with opening up a topic that I suspect will be the subject of some of our questions here in the audience. That is mass shootings. We talked about them in passing. We didn't talk about them directly. Phillip, one of your columns reads as a caption, "All gun owners aren't created equal, nor should they be treated equally." I trust it's your position, but clarify if it's not, that the people who created the mass shootings that take our headlines, whether it's Chardon or Colorado, are not the folks you would like to see have guns. But if that's so, how do we keep them out of their hands?
That's the $64 million question. I mean, you look at T.J. Lane, the Chardon shooter. He stole a gun from an uncle. You look at the shooter, Laza in Sandy Hook. I believe he got into his mother's arsenal.
No, his mother gave it to him as a present.
Okay. Well, bottom line is this is a young man who, in and of himself, probably would have been forbidden to get that gun. But he somehow got access to that weapon. So, to frame the argument around mentally ill shooters that are somehow going to continue to be able to access weapons, I think is somehow framing this argument in the wrong way. Because these shooters, I mean, obviously he didn't go through a background check. And a lot of the people that will continue to find guns and to be a problem going forward, they will be able to get into the stream of guns that are out there and shoot and cause the havoc that they do. So at the end of the day, back to the public health piece of this, of course, we have to remain vigilant on that. But the question of all gun owners aren't created equal, of course not. But access to gun ownership also isn't created equal, because it'd be very easy to walk out of this building today and find a gun. I know where you could do it right now.
Right. So we're running out of time, so for once in my life I'll try to be short, and I'm sure I'll fail. The issue of the dramatically deadly, the mass shootings are out there. So again, think about it from a middle ground. We don't have to make it easy for people to kill folks. So the fact that you have semi-automatic weapons, and it isn't just the AR-15, which is a military assault weapon that's been rebranded by the National Sports Shooting Foundation, which is located down the street from Sandy Hook School, by the way, as the modern shooting rifle. That's an insult. If a hunter needs a banana clip with 30 bullets in it to go deer hunting, they don't need an AR-15, they need shooting lessons. And so the fact that we're dealing with semi-automatic weapons and very large clips that don't have to be changed out, that's where common ground can show up. If you read the Second Amendment, you interpret that we need a citizenry that's a militia that could take on the U.S. Army, which is the logical conclusion of some of this stuff. Well, there's no common ground either. Let's go back to the 1920s when you had Machine Gun Kelly and Al Capone running around. The Thompson submachine gun was banned. It would not be banned today. Why was it banned? Because the bad guys had more weapons than the good guys.
Which is a problem today still.
It is a problem. So we have to think about, again, finding a common ground. There are going to be people on the extremes that aren't going to be happy with it. But is there a world, in a modern urban society, is there a place for a 30 or 50 clip banana ammunition clip? Do we have to have semi-automatic handguns where you don't have to stop to kill people? And should we really be worried about and regulate the trigger strength of a gun so that you actually have to go boom, boom, boom rather than touch it? And the other thing, which is really important, is should people have weapons and a license to have weapons if they haven't gone through firearms training? We regulate automobiles to a much more saner extent than we do these guns, but I still don't want to take it away from someone that feels that they have a reason for self-protection, for target shooting, or for hunting, but we have to make certain that society as a whole isn't bearing costs. I mean, we didn't stand up in the Berlin Wall and say we will bear any cost to allow this privilege to continue.
Phillip, I'll give you the last word here as columnist to respond to that.
Yeah, I would agree with most of what Dr. Hill said. You know, we have to be always vigilant about the high capacity weaponry out there that creates these situations for mass casualties. But I think if you look at the situation holistically, take the wide view, the type of weaponry that you're talking about, it's used in a very rare amount of the deaths that we're seeing day in, day out. I mean, most of the deaths we see, you might see some semi-automatic weapons, but for the most part, we're not talking about this high-velocity stuff.
Well, no, so, you are talking about semi-automatic handguns.
I think it's easy to trot out the boogeyman argument, and that's legitimate. It has to be a part of the conversation. But at the same time, if you're looking for common ground, I think the rhetoric and the language also has to be based in reality. And you know, how are most people dying? What is the weaponry? And while you could take the extremes on both sides of the issue, if you continue to do that, it's going to be even more difficult to find that middle ground.
And I agree with you. I just want to, the point I want to make clear is when people talk about semi-automatics, they go automatically to the AR-15. But there are semi-automatic handguns with large capacity clips, and they're doing more damage than the AR-15. So the point I want to make is it is actually the technology that enables mass casualty is what we should be focusing on.
Before we find fissures in our common ground, everyone, I'd like to thank our guests here for discussing this very important topic of the Second Amendment. Thank you, gentlemen.
It's so fragile, the common ground, isn't it? Yeah, you guys are doing fantastic. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are all participating in a Friday Forum panel conversation on guns and common ground with Phillip Morris, plain dealer columnist, and Ned Hill, Dean of the Maxine, Goodman, Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University. Our moderator today is Dennis Terez, the federal public defender for the Northern District of Ohio and currently for the entire state, as I understand it. We will return to our panel momentarily for the traditional City Club question and answer period. We encourage you to formulate your questions for our speakers now and remind you that your questions should be brief, to the point, and in fact questions. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, and on IdeaStream, our primary media partner, and WTAM, one of the many radio stations across the country that carry City Club forums. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. Today's forum is sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Media Group, the City Club's sponsor for politics and policy programs. And today we also welcome guests at a table hosted by CSU's Maxine, Goodman, Levin College of Urban Affairs. Thank you very much for your support. Next Friday, February 28th, the City Club is pleased to welcome John Churchill, Secretary of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. For more information about our upcoming forums, or to make a reservation or order a CD or DVD of today's programs, please visit us online at cityclub.org. And now we return to our speakers for the traditional City Club question and answers. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests and brand new members. Holding the microphones today are Program Director Carrie Miller and Administrative Assistant Kirsten Pianka. Our first question, please.
Over here. Good afternoon. The powers that be in D.C. and Congress continue to destroy the quality of lives of many millions of people by cutting off unemployment benefits and food stamps and so forth, which certainly exacerbates poverty. And it also drives young people into gangs because they're in such dysfunctional families. My question is, what do you think about the impact of poverty on the numbers of shootings and homicides and what that's going on in this country?
You talk about conflating two massive issues there, but that's a wonderful question. And it's something that I think about from time to time. In fact, back in the green room, you know, we had a discussion about the number of young men, especially young black men, who, for whatever reasons, have made a mistake and they have a criminal, they have a felony on their background. which prohibits them from being a legal gun owner into perpetuity. So a lot of these guys, even though they've gone straight, they remain in neighborhoods where having a gun it's basically a way of life, and in some ways it represents the difference between life and death or being a victim. So you know, the question of poverty is a real one. But how do we get away from the issue of violence and connecting that with gun ownership? I think perhaps one of the conversations we can have in the search for middle ground is looking at the notion of whether or not a person that was convicted of, let's say, a minor felony, a nonviolent felony at some point in their life should be permanently prohibited from owning a weapon. Because a lot of these young people become career criminals just by virtue of the fact that they're owning a gun and carrying a gun, but they believe that they have no alternative. So I think your question is a good one, but I'm not sure I have the good answer for you.
One of the great tragedies of the failure of school systems, the failure of literacy, the failure, particularly for young men, to earn a living, is they wrap their manhood around the barrel of a gun. And we can't separate that. And we also have to understand that there are illegal activities, drugs and the selling and distribution of drugs are part and parcel of all that. So again, part of thinking about where the common ground goes is as someone gets older, they get more mature, is there a way in which you could, as Phillip was talking about, making them more eligible to work by possibly erasing the felony or let Dennis's people do their legal magic. But I think that we have to realize, make couple clear statements. Criminals should never have guns. Gangs should not have more firepower than the police. And the distribution of guns, the distribution, not of guns, but of drugs, can ruin someone's life. And beyond that, we can't solve the poverty issue and the gun issue in 5 minutes.
I might add that the federal statutes of our country have long had a section under Title 18 United States Code 922G. Every prosecutor and defense lawyer knows it well. It is the in perpetuity prohibition that Phillip just mentioned. Once you have a felony on your record, you're never allowed under federal law to possess, and that's also constructive possession of a gun. You not even need to hold it, you just can't be around it. And we as taxpayers pay mightily for that protection because every U.S. Attorney's office in the country routinely on drug cases involving what Ned said, gun violence, often charge both the drug trafficking and the gun possession, and Congress has seen fit to actually add mandatory minimums to penalties when guns are used in drug trafficking, so when the two come together. We pay for it through prison time, but it's also severely punished and given a message to the people who own guns.
It also means the person gets out, can't take a very simple job. Well, not so simple anymore, but a commercial truck driver. They can't get a commercial truck driving license. So if we think about the jobs that are opening up, say in shale development, that it means that anybody who has a drug and gun conviction can't drive a truck.
Next.
You all mentioned that we live in a society that is very fearful. It's a sales tool when you're developing a housing area that this is a secure or a gated community. Mm-hmm. Why are we so fearful?
Well, there are a couple things going on. The data are really kind of interesting. So incidence of crime is going down. Some of it, maybe lots of people locked up. I actually think a lot of it has to do with the aging of the population, the fact that crack epidemic is past us. Who knows what the current heroin epidemic is going to do. But there's a lot of marketing goes in to scare the bejesus out of us. And if someone can make money out of scaring the bejesus out of you, it's gonna happen. So that is a freedom of speech issue. And it also means that if someone is distorting truth and reality for commercial gain, they shouldn't be permitted against freedom of speech, but it means other responsible voices should push back, tell what the truth is.
And I think we're also somewhat nervous, and I'll point the finger at my own industry. We live in a 24-hour news cycle where you'll see the same murder repeated over and over again during the course of a day or an evening. So, you know, the whole notion of why are we nervous, you know, it's the public encounters. I mean, the loud music encounter, the Walmart encounter. While statistically, you know, it may not be what we've projected it to be, and we're throwing large shadows. The reality is, you know, so many of us are running out and arming ourselves because we do believe that the boogeyman is out there. We do believe that if we leave ourselves vulnerable, someone will get the drop on us, and you know, it'll come back to hurt us.
This kind of dovetails with what you were just talking about here, although I've been thinking about this question for a while. The decisions coming out of Florida now regarding stand your ground are concerning to me, and I think to other people as well, because there seems to be such a reverence being held for the subjective perception of people. And does that bother you, and do you think that is going to continue? Do you think ultimately a court's going to say, no, there has to be some objective standard here as to why you shot somebody?
I'm going to leave that to the columnist who's written about it and the attorney that gets involved in court on it.
Yeah, I'm very concerned about stand your ground and the way it's evolving. I'm a firm believer in the castle doctrine. I think the laws of self-defense are universal. You have the right to protect your home. You have the right to protect your property. You have the right to protect yourself when you're in your vehicle. But when it starts to get a little nebulous for me is the notion that I can walk down the street and have an encounter with someone. Maybe it's something as basic or something as simple as a bad look, or as they say in the street, recklessly eyeballing somebody. Or you know, you could have a situation where maybe a cross word is exchanged, and you can go from that to a situation where there's a physical encounter, and a firearm could be used. And as we see from the situation over the weekend in Phoenix, Arizona, this guy is legitimately claiming self-defense, even though he was involved in the wrong fistfight. So I think the courts are going to continue to wrestle with this, especially as we see other states adopt similar laws, because as it stands now, it's too loose, it's too nebulous, and it does make a lot of us really nervous, as it does you.
And any law that encourages people to not avoid a confrontation is a problem.
The castle doctrine's not going anywhere, frankly. It's being modified and addressed, but it is a very popular and well-established doctrine. Mm-hmm. Phillip, you're right. It's how the courts are discussing it and analyzing it on the fringes, maybe even beyond the home, which is a difficult area. I might add that the George Zimmerman case was a very weak one from the prosecutor's perspective. It's often lost on the fact that the prosecution actually asked for a conviction on a lesser included offense for him, something that usually the defense is doing, but it showed the weakness of their case. That was lost somewhat in the discussion, and I think it's dealing with what Phillip just mentioned. Courts, too, are grappling with those edges of the doctrine.
And if we really are starting a civil conversation about what the terrain of common ground is, castle doctrine has to be put off to the side. It goes back to English common law.
It is one of those common grounds.
So that we start with the conversation that we don't assault the doctrine.
That's right.
Now, stand your ground, different issue.
Sir.
Gentlemen, thank you for a thoughtful, quiet conversation about the subject.
Brother, we've never been accused of being quiet before.
And neither have you, Homer.
Probably true. But on the concealed carry, I haven't practiced law, and particularly criminal law, for a long time, so maybe I should defer to Mr. Terez. But back in the old days before concealed carry, African-American young males were probably the primary targets of felony convictions for carrying a concealed weapon, even if it was just to protect themselves. And Dr. Hill, I would suggest that the real question about, you know, whether concealed carry or castle doctrine or anything else is effective is not the body count. That's not the intent of it. The intent is not to have a body count. So if you've deterred someone from continuing with the criminal activity that might hurt you or your family or others, you know, that's the real object of having the right to protection. I don't know. There's an email that goes around. It may be apocryphal. I'm not sure, but it claims that there's 150 countries that have a greater death rate, murder rate, than the United States, all of whom prohibit the ownership of guns. So there's something other than gun ownership, certainly, that goes into murder rates and things, and it's not an absolute protection. But going from the castle doctrine to the stand your ground, isn't there some point where a person should also have the right to say, I couldn't retreat, and shouldn't somebody have to prove that? That is, the prosecution have to prove that there was an absolute right or ability to retreat, not putting the reasonable doubt or even a preponderance of the evidence standard on the person who's trying to defend themselves.
Oh, I was going to give it to the attorney.
We say talk to my attorney?
Well, Homer, there's a lot in that statement. I mean, the first thing I thought about when you were raising some of the issues you raised were the notion that this nation has always had the so-called black codes that governed gun ownership, especially when it came to black men. Right after the Civil War, at least 2 states, Alabama and Mississippi, forbade black men to own a gun because, memories of slavery obviously are still fresh in their minds. And I think even moving forward up into the laws that we're talking about right now, about a young person with a minor felony, a nonviolent felony on their record, are still forever prohibited from owning that weapon. And then if they do, which they often do, go out and take possession of a weapon, they put themselves in further danger of not being able to participate in our society. So the whole notion of castle, stand your ground, I think we have to realize that we're pulling on so many different threads here. And back to the man's question back there about why are we so nervous, I think a lot of it is rooted in our history. We historically have been a very, very nervous people because of things that have happened in the nation's history. And going forward, the fact now that we're so armed to the teeth and we've proven ourselves willing to use weapons, the prudent person at this point, I believe, is operating with the notion that I should arm myself.
We'll disagree on that last one. But that's where the conversation is.
On prudent person or arming themselves?
No, the prudent person arming themselves. But again, that depends on neighborhood. It depends on context.
Right.
Although it's interesting on a jury case in this district where randomly picked jurors are polled by the lawyers at the beginning of the case in their selection period, it is a prudent lawyer who asks, do you own a gun? Does anyone in your family own a gun? Because it's a gun case and you want to flesh out any prejudice there. Routinely, out of a group of 30 or so prospective jurors, you could count on a half a dozen or so or more who don't want to tell that they do own a gun.
Well, the polling shows that between 30 and 40% of all households in the United States have firearms.
And that's reflected clearly in our jury pools.
And that's part of the reason why the notion of gun banishment is not common ground.
Right. Next question.
Oh, back over there.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Gary. I appreciate your time. I heard some statistics thrown around that I'm not quite sure about, such as the fact that nursing homes are filled with people who have been wounded by gunshots. I'll have to check into that. But one statistic I did not hear was the fact that the Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership put out that last century between 120 million to 190 million people were killed, I should say murdered by their own government, and what precluded that, what came before that, was registration of firearms. So I don't know about the rest of you, but that makes me nervous. So I've heard talk about nervousness. I'm not sure how you feel about that.
You talked very quickly and softly, and I couldn't quite pick up what the comment was.
The main point is that Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership has put out that in the last 100 years, last century, between 120 million to 190 million, depending on how you count it, of citizens were murdered by their own government. And before those murders happened, most of them began by gun or firearms ownership registration. My question and my point is that makes me nervous, and so I'm curious how you feel about that.
Well, I'll jump in on that one from the law perspective. When President Obama came up with proposed legislation for gun control, there was a rash of sales for ammo, and the price of ammunition went up, way up, and some stores sold out of it.
He's been the best gun salesman America's ever had.
I throw out as a question, as a rhetorical question to that concern, was that necessary? I mean, honestly, we couldn't get gun control legislation through yet, and I don't know of any other additional restrictions that's been placed upon gun ownership after he spoke to the public. So I just throw that as a rhetorical question. I don't know if our concerns are often based in reality and fact, rather than the political and the polemic discussion here.
Yeah. Again, if you interpret the Second Amendment, and I really want to stay away from the Second Amendment because I don't think it's going to reflect where American society is going to end up. But if you look at the Second Amendment, you could read the Federalist Papers, you could read Hamilton and Madison's response around the Second Amendment. And it was clear that in a post-revolutionary society, actually, yeah, that was a post-revolutionary society, there was a thought that the yeoman farmer, otherwise the free white man, should have the ability to arm themselves to repeal a central government. And as a result, Hamilton lost the fight for a permanent central army. We lost the argument for a permanent military academy. In fact, even Jackson wanted it and went back. And the notion of gun ownership was one so that the citizens can rise up against an oppressive central government. If you really believe that's what the goal of the Second Amendment is and should be, then logic would drive you to say that the yeoman citizenry should have enough armament and firepower to repeal the army of the current central government, which is the U.S. Army. If you follow that line of argument, then RPGs are next. And that's the reason why I don't want to go, and the ban against the Thompson submachine gun should go away. I think that in today's urban society, given the history and traditions of the United States, the notion that we have to be armed to repeal our central government's army is an insult to the Constitution and to our history. And so it's an argument that I will acknowledge can be made, and reasonable people who I respect can make it, but it's not an argument I'm even going to engage in, because arming the citizenry to be able to take on the U.S. Marine Corps is not where we are as a society, and that's not where we're going to end up.
We have time for two more questions, perhaps?
Dr. Hill, the concern I have about the position you're taking is that you're focusing on weapons. When you focus on a particular type of firearms, that's what I think makes advocates of the Second Amendment nervous. For example, you talk about the Thompson submachine gun being illegal. It's not. You can legally own a machine gun today. You just have to get registered for it. You have to pay $200 tax for it and get a background check. So, and when you start talking about the type of firearms, it makes, as I said, people nervous. So instead of talking about the type of firearms as a matter of common ground, you should talk about the areas, the people that are causing the crime. Who are the people that are causing the crime? Let's find common ground and who those are, and how we stop those people from committing the crime. And I would venture to say most of it, firearms violence, is in the drug arena, where people are involved with drugs, drug dealers, etc. Now, how do we keep the firearms out of the hands of drug dealers? That's something where I think we need to be focusing our efforts. What do you think about that?
I agree with 50%, disagree with 50%, so we aren't doing bad. Keeping firearms out of drug dealers, felons, potential felons, and street criminals, absolutely. That's beyond debate. When it comes to talking about the social acceptability of semi-automatic weapons and high-capacity ammunition clips, I do believe, on that one, I do believe that there's not a civic purpose for it. So as I look at firearms and firearm registry, I'll tell you where I stand right now, which is if you have a firearm, you should be fully trained, and I applaud and recognize the NRA's firearm safety training courses. They've had a positive impact. The ability of large capacity ammunition clips, it boggles my mind. I don't understand it. Someone who has a firearm, I believe, should have liability insurance to make certain that damage that's inflicted by that firearm can be compensated, and not on the part of the victim themselves. I mean, this is where I am standing. I don't think society's going to end up there. And I also believe that every firearm should be registered, and that every firearm should be tracked, and that life history of that firearm should also be tracked, so that you could see where it went to and how it leaks. There are certain ways of selling firearms which are perfectly legal now, particularly unregistered sales, I think, are indeed a problem. So we have to figure out, and I'm not saying that I'm in the center and this is where we're going to end up, but this is where I start. I see firearms as a liability issue that should be treated with the same level and seriousness as an automobile. And I don't think we're going to agree on it.
We have time for one more question. One short question.
Yeah. Excuse me. I have a question regarding, at one point we were shifting the debate a little bit towards finance. And I'm intrigued by that because I think there's some common ground to be found when we look at it through a financial eye. In particular, cost of ownership and what can be done with cost of ownership and earmarking that cost of ownership or earmarking the funds, taxation, other things towards root causes to try and alleviate some of the problems, in particular poverty and education.
As moderator, I'm going to limit our speakers to 1 minute on the question, just watching our clock.
Yes. Yours.
Yeah. Yes, but understanding that that type of approach will most certainly lead to an expansion of the black market out there, which has already flooded our streets with illegal weapons. So while an effort to further tax, to further regulate legal weapons is a reasonable pursuit and maybe part of that middle ground, I think you also have to be aware of the fact that the illegal market will continue to blossom.
Again, I'd like to thank our speakers for being here today.
Today at the City Club, we've been participating in a Friday Forum panel conversation about guns and common ground. Thank you very much, Mr. Morris, Dr. Hill, and Councilor Dennis Terez. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you too for your participation. This forum is now adjourned.